Benny Hart had never been the kind of man who made a fuss. At 59, his life had narrowed itself into something small but manageable: early mornings, quiet nights, a battered Ford pickup, and the constant humming anxiety of getting by in a world that didn't wait for slow hands or tired knees. He wasn't proud or bitter, just tired. And maybe that's why he noticed it later than he should have. The quiet theft happening right under his nose didn't come with smashed windows or obvious damage. No, this was something sneakier, slower, like a whisper in the dark. At first, he chalked it up to memory, a miscalculation. After all, he drove for a living. A lot. Maybe he had taken a few extra detours last week. Maybe the fuel gauge was sticking again. That old Ford had a mind of its own some days. Still, the numbers didn't lie. The route to the parts depot and back was 36 miles round trip. The tank should have lasted 3 days. It barely made 2. Benny wasn't the paranoid type, but when something begins to chip away at your means of survival, you feel it like a draft in an old house. It's subtle at first, easy to ignore, but then it becomes personal. The truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was his lifeline. He worked part-time for a small logistics outfit that did specialty deliveries, the kind no one wanted: early morning fuel runs for remote customers, moving oddball parts across the state line, occasionally hauling equipment through back roads the GPS didn't even bother mapping. The work wasn't steady, but it paid just enough. Losing the truck, or even losing time to a breakdown, meant missed paychecks. Missed paychecks meant rent trouble. Rent trouble meant losing the small home he rented behind the Webster's main house. It was one of those backyard setups common in older neighborhoods, quiet, a little worn, but cheap and blessedly private. He liked the Websters. They were kind enough to keep to themselves and expected the same in return. Their neighbor, however, was another story entirely. Karen Dalton lived 2 doors down, in a house that was twice as big as it needed to be and half as welcoming as it looked. The lawn was immaculate, the shutters were painted seasonally, and the garbage bins were wheeled out at exactly 7:01 a.m. every Friday without fail. The kind of woman who would watch you through her blinds if your lawnmower was 10 minutes too loud. The kind who spoke in brittle smiles and opened conversations with no offense, but followed by something vaguely threatening. Benny had crossed her once by letting the truck idle too long during a cold morning warm-up. She came out in a robe and slippers, waving a mug of herbal tea and demanding to know if he was trying to gas the entire block. He had apologized and turned off the engine, not because he agreed, but because men like Benny knew that arguing with women like Karen was like digging a hole in dry sand, exhausting and pointless. Still, that memory floated back to him as he stood beside the Ford one chilly Thursday morning, staring at the fuel gauge and doing silent math. He hadn't driven since the last delivery on Tuesday. That meant the truck had been parked, unmoved, for nearly 30 hours, yet a quarter tank had vanished. Gone, like it evaporated. That was the 3rd time this month. He squatted down and checked for leaks, even crawled halfway under the truck, ignoring the protesting creaks of his joints. The gravel was cold beneath his palms, and the early frost hadn't quite lifted, clinging in streaks to the undercarriage. But there was nothing, no stains, no smell, no trace. The cap was screwed on tight. The lines were dry. It just didn't make sense. That night, he sat on his small back porch, nursing a lukewarm cup of instant coffee and staring out into the dark. The street was quiet, as usual. Porch lights flickered on here and there, but no one was out. The neighborhood was mostly older folks now, people who remembered a time when neighbors knew each other's names and left their doors unlocked. That trust had withered over the years, replaced with motion sensor lights, online gossip groups, and suspicion disguised as caution. Benny didn't blame anyone. The world had changed, and you either adjusted or got run over. He sipped the coffee and mulled over the idea of installing a camera, but that wasn't his style. Besides, he didn't want to look like he was accusing anyone. Accusing meant confrontation, and confrontation meant trouble. He just wanted peace. Maybe that made him naive. Or maybe it just made him tired. Still, the problem wasn't going away. And the next morning it got worse. He had an early drop-off scheduled an hour outside of town, one of his regulars, a contractor who paid cash and didn't like waiting. Benny always fueled up the night before a delivery, but this time he hadn't bothered, convinced there was enough in the tank. He was wrong. 15 miles out, the truck coughed and died on a narrow strip of back road with no shoulder and no cell service. He sat in the cab, gripping the wheel as cold air leaked in through the seals, and for the first time in a long while, felt something close to panic. Not the dramatic kind. Not chest-gripping, scream-for-help panic. The other kind. The quiet, slow burn of dread that sits low in your gut. He was late. The client wouldn't wait. The job was blown, and it all came down to a few missing gallons of gas. It took 2 hours to flag down a passing truck, borrow a jerry can, and limp to the nearest gas station. By the time he got back to town, the client had left angry messages and promised to never hire a fool who can't manage his own gas tank. That job had paid for 2 weeks of groceries. Gone. That night, he didn't bother with the coffee. He sat on the porch again, but this time with a pen and a notepad. He wrote down every fuel fill-up, every delivery, every mile logged in the past 2 weeks. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, but his mind was racing. Patterns began to emerge. Fuel levels dropping overnight. Always when the truck was parked on the street. Always when he had a full tank. Always after 11 p.m. That was no accident. He circled the numbers and underlined the dates. The next line he wrote in all caps. Someone is stealing my gas. The thought felt ridiculous, juvenile even. Who did that? Who siphoned gas in 2025? And in this neighborhood? It sounded like something out of a movie set in the 70s. But the data didn't lie. Something was happening. Someone was taking his fuel. And the longer it went on, the more it cost him. Not just money, but time, trust, and sanity. And while he wasn't a man built for revenge or dramatics, he was done pretending it wasn't real. He stared out into the night, jaw tight, and made himself a quiet promise he wouldn't go down the aggressive road. No shouting matches, no accusations without proof. But he was going to stop it. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would find out who was draining his truck and make damn sure it never happened again. Because this wasn't about gas anymore. It was about someone thinking they could get away with taking from him. And Benny Hart had already lost more than enough in his life. He wasn't going to let it happen again. Not quietly. Not this time. The next few days passed under a weight Benny hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear. Not exactly, it was more like a creeping awareness, a sense that something was out of place in the quiet rhythm of his life. Like a low-frequency hum that only he could hear. He carried on as usual up before sunrise, coffee without sugar, checking his delivery schedule, topping off the Ford's tank when necessary, but the tension lived in his shoulders now, in the way he double-checked the truck locks. In the quiet glances he cast toward the street every night before bed. He didn't tell anyone, not even the Websters, who always waved politely from the main house but didn't ask questions. Benny had never been a man who invited attention, and he wasn't about to start now, not over something that could still just barely be dismissed as bad luck or coincidence. But he knew. Deep down he knew. And once that switch flipped in a man's mind, once suspicion became certainty, there was no going back. It was around this time that the idea of a camera came up again, not because Benny liked the thought of spying on his own street, but because it had started to feel like the only way to reclaim control. But then came the real dilemma, where to put it, and how to do it without tipping his hand. The truck was parked directly in front of the small gate that led from the street into the walkway beside his rental. There were no awnings or porch lights to mount anything discreetly, and he couldn't afford a fancy wireless setup. Even if he could, the thought of poring over grainy footage made him feel queasy. He didn't want to watch someone stealing from him. He wanted them to stop. He wanted them to feel, just once, what it was like to be watched. But not by a lens, by presence, by pressure. Instead of setting up surveillance, Benny chose a different path. He drove to a local supply shop he hadn't visited in years, a place that sold parts for lawn mowers, ATVs, and farm equipment machines with fuel tanks often left unattended. After 30 minutes and a pointed conversation with a tired man behind the counter, Benny walked out with a solution: a small inline sensor that could track changes in fuel level and transmit the data to a simple mobile reader. No cameras, no recording, just a history log of every drop. It wasn't cheap, but it was cheaper than losing another job. Installing it took all afternoon. He wired it under the rear wheel well and linked the transmitter to a cheap readout device he kept in his coat pocket. If anything changed in the tank while the truck was idle, he'd see it. Simple. Quiet. Effective. That night he filled the tank to the brim, parked the truck, locked everything, and went inside. He didn't stay up watching the street or pacing the floor. He didn't even make coffee. Instead, he turned off the lights, lay down on the thin mattress that passed for his bed, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep never came. At 3:42 a.m., the sensor pinged. 10.3 liters, gone. He didn't move. He didn't storm out or throw open the door. He just lay there in the dark, heart pounding, hand on the sensor reader, staring at the glowing numbers. And just like that, it wasn't a theory anymore. It was real. Someone had walked up to his truck, opened the fuel cap, and helped themselves in the middle of the night, like it was nothing. Like he didn't matter. The next morning, Benny walked a wide loop around the truck before approaching. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches, no puddles, just a faint footprint on the rear tire, where someone had leaned for leverage. It was small, maybe a woman's, maybe a narrow man's, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the pattern. This wasn't a random theft. This was someone close, someone who knew his routine, knew when he'd be asleep, knew that no one would be watching. Someone who had probably done it before, and would do it again. For the first time, Benny allowed his eyes to drift toward Karen's house. It sat 3 doors down, set back just enough to make it impossible to see clearly from his window, but close enough for someone to walk over under cover of darkness. Her driveway was always empty overnight. He remembered that now. She didn't drive much, claimed she worked from home, though no one seemed to know what exactly she did. She'd once mentioned consulting, in that vague way people do when they want you to stop asking. What stuck with him most, though, was the energy Karen had, the kind of persistent, needling presence that made her impossible to ignore. And lately she'd taken to watching him more often. Just standing near her mailbox, sipping from that oversized travel mug, eyes flicking toward him whenever he stepped out. Not smiling, not speaking, just watching. He couldn't be sure it was her, not yet. And accusing her without proof would only make things worse. She'd take it as a declaration of war. Benny didn't want war. He wanted it to stop. But now he was certain. This wasn't just a neighborhood problem. It was personal. Someone had decided that his things were up for grabs, and that made it more than just fuel. It made it a test. How far could they go before he pushed back? How long would he keep turning the other cheek? The answer, it turned out, was one more night. He filled the tank again, locked the cap, and parked the truck in the same spot. But this time he left a second cap, an old decoy he'd modified with a release valve. He rigged a tube to run into a sealed container beneath the truck bed, filled not with fuel, but with a mixture of salt water, denatured alcohol, and a trace amount of lubricant. Harmless to the environment, but guaranteed to ruin any pump or filter it touched. Legal, traceable, and enough to send a very clear message: next time you try to steal from me, you're going to pay for it. He waited. At 2:19 a.m., the sensor pinged again. 12 liters, drained. Benny didn't move. He didn't even get out of bed. He just watched the numbers on the reader stop climbing and then reset to 0, indicating the false tank had been emptied. He turned over and went back to sleep. The following morning, the neighborhood was humming with a new kind of energy. Not overt, but charged, like the air before a storm. Benny walked outside with his coffee and stood beside the truck, pretending to inspect the tires. He didn't have to wait long. At exactly 8:04 a.m., Karen stormed out of her house, phone in hand, red-faced and muttering to herself. She didn't look at Benny, didn't wave. Just got into her car, a car that hadn't moved in days, and drove off faster than usual, tires squealing slightly as she turned the corner. Benny didn't smile. He just nodded to himself and went back inside. That should have been the end of it. It should have stopped there. But some people don't know how to let things go. And the trap Benny had set? It hadn't just caught a thief. It had caught something bigger, something uglier, something that didn't like being challenged. The neighborhood changed after that morning, not in ways you could point to on a map or describe in detail, but in the way things felt the weight of silence. The careful pace of small routines, the sudden drop in eye contact from people who used to wave without thinking. Benny noticed it on a Wednesday. The postman, who usually gave a nod or a brief smile, kept his eyes on the sidewalk. One of the Webster's nieces, who occasionally visited with her 2 kids, seemed to turn away more quickly when passing by his gate. And Karen hadn't returned that same day. She drove off in a hurry. Her house remained closed up, blinds drawn, garbage bins untouched. For a moment, Benny thought maybe she had taken the message to heart. Maybe she'd backed off. Maybe she'd left. But deep down, he knew better. People like Karen didn't disappear. They recoiled. They waited. They recalculated. They returned. And return she did. It began subtly in a way that almost made Benny question his instincts again. A week after the trap incident, he came outside to find a fine dusting of white powder scattered near his back steps. At first he thought it was pollen or maybe spilled detergent from a neighbor's laundry. But it had a chemical smell, sharp and biting, like an industrial cleaner. He washed it away without much thought. The next day, there were fresh scuffs on his driver's side door, thin, uneven, the kind a plastic bag full of keys or a metal clasp might make. Again, he didn't jump to conclusions. Accidents happened. Maybe a delivery guy brushed past, maybe some kid on a bike. But then came the mail. His electric bill showed up 3 days later than usual, and it was wet through soaked, in fact, as though it had been deliberately dunked. When he asked the Websters if their mail had been delayed, they looked surprised. "Ours came on time," Mrs. Webster said, holding up a neat stack of envelopes. No water damage, no delay, just his. Just his, again. That night, Benny sat on the edge of his bed, not reading, not watching TV, just sitting, staring at the blank wall like it might offer some kind of clarity. He felt the tightness growing again in his chest, not fear, not panic, but the slow burn pressure of being cornered. It wasn't the theft that bothered him now. It wasn't even the strange behavior. It was the intent behind it. Someone was trying to provoke him. Someone wanted a reaction. He thought about going back to the police. Not to file a report, not yet, but to update Bart, the retired cop who now worked part-time consulting for citizen complaints. Benny had met him once a few years back at a local community meeting and had spoken with him briefly over the phone during the fuel siphoning incident. Bart wasn't an enforcer. He didn't carry a badge anymore. But he had something better: memory, reputation. He remembered faces, knew who to nudge and who to warn. Benny decided to take a walk the next day and stop by the Civic Center where Bart handled paperwork and sat through town meetings with all the enthusiasm of a man trying to stay busy after real work had ended. Bart didn't say much as Benny recounted what had been happening, just listened, leaned back, nodded occasionally, and kept his fingers pressed together in that still, impatient way older cops seemed to master. When Benny was finished, Bart let out a long breath and looked out the window for a moment before speaking. "You want my honest take?" he said. "You poked something that didn't like being poked. She's not done. People like her, they escalate in silence. No fists, no shouting, just pressure, enough to make you crack first, so they can call the cops and say they're the victim." Benny nodded slowly. He already knew. "You want me to make a record of this?" Bart asked. Not a report, just a file. Something with your name on it, in case this keeps going? Benny agreed. It was quiet insurance, and he knew enough about the system to understand the value of a paper trail, even a small one. That decision would prove to be more important than he realized. 3 days later, he came home from a delivery to find a city citation posted on his gate. The notice claimed he was in violation of local sanitation ordinances, specifically improper chemical disposal. The charge was vague but serious enough to carry a fine and a formal inspection. Benny stood there, staring at the paper in the weak sunlight, his hands tightening involuntarily. There had been no chemical disposal. He didn't even keep solvents or cleaners in the house. The only thing remotely chemical had been the decoy fluid in the fake fuel tank, and that had been sealed, safe and gone now. This was something else. This was retaliation. He called the number on the notice and spoke calmly with a woman at the office who assured him the complaint had come from a verified neighborhood resident. No name was given, of course, but Benny didn't need one, and he knew. The inspection was scheduled for Friday. On Thursday evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the air began to cool, Benny walked the perimeter of his property. He didn't find anything until he checked the alley behind the house, the narrow stretch between his rental and the Webster's back fence. There, nestled between a stack of old bricks and a broken lawn chair, was an open container with what looked like paint residue on the inside. A paintbrush, crusted and dry, lay across the rim. It wasn't his. He'd never painted anything back there. And the container looked too deliberately placed, too conveniently visible. A plant. Evidence. Something someone could discover if the inspector happened to walk the route Karen suggested. Benny didn't touch it. He didn't move it. He called Bart. Bart arrived 20 minutes later, no uniform, no sirens, just a quiet truck and a cooler head. He examined the container, took a few photos with his phone, and whistled low under his breath. "She's setting you up," he said simply. You need to get ahead of this." He advised Benny to document everything, take pictures, write dates, log each incident. "Don't confront her," Bart added. "Not yet. Let her keep thinking you're passive. That's what gives you the upper hand." The inspection came and went the next day. The inspector, a tired-looking man in his 40s, seemed embarrassed to even be there. Benny walked him through the house, the yard, showed him his fuel log, the receipts, the fake tank's empty chamber, and finally the planted container, which he hadn't touched. The man nodded, took a few notes, and promised a report within the week. No citation was issued, no fine was levied. Just another notch in a growing list of strange events. Karen didn't show her face that weekend. Her house remained silent. No lights in the front room, no activity in the driveway. But Benny noticed something new, a car parked at the end of the block, one he didn't recognize. A gray compact with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. It stayed for an hour, then left. The next night it returned. Same spot. Same duration. Always facing the same direction toward his rental. Watching. It was then Benny realized something that chilled him far more than fuel theft or scratched paint ever could. This wasn't just about gas. This wasn't even about Karen's pride anymore. This had become a campaign, a methodical, escalating campaign to intimidate, isolate, and eventually discredit him. And whether she was working alone or had enlisted help, he didn't know. But the message was clear: she wanted him gone, out, defeated, humiliated. But Benny Hart wasn't going anywhere. He didn't have much. No family, no retirement plan, no fallback. But he had the truck. He had the rental. And now he had documentation, witnesses. A paper trail. It wasn't strength in the traditional sense. It wasn't fists or guns or revenge fantasies. It was something quieter, more dangerous. It was resolve. The following week brought rain, the kind that falls sideways, tapping angrily against windows and pooling in the gutters like a warning from the sky itself. Benny sat by the window one evening, lights off, watching the narrow street through a fogged pane of glass. The truck was parked exactly where it always was, perfectly framed beneath the dim yellow streetlight, its shape blurred and ghost-like in the downpour. He hadn't driven in 2 days, not because there was no work, but because the client list had started thinning. The man in Ashburn had stopped calling. The couple in Lake Ridge had hired someone else. The jobs were drying up, and Benny knew why. Word had spread, not in the loud, public way of gossip, but in the quieter, more corrosive way of insinuation. No one wanted to hire someone surrounded by problems. No one wanted a man involved in weird neighborhood stuff. That's how rumors worked when they started close to home. They didn't travel like wildfire, they seeped slow and quiet, like mold behind wallpaper, until you breathed them in without knowing it. And that was what made this worse than theft or vandalism or even sabotage. Karen wasn't just trying to rattle him anymore. She was isolating him. Box by box, contact by contact, she was severing his ties. And people were going along with it, not because they believed her necessarily, but because people preferred to step away from tension rather than stand inside it. Benny didn't blame them. He just noted it and added it to the tally. The city inspector's report came back that Tuesday. No violations, no fines, but the damage had already been done. The citation, however baseless, had started a file. And once a file existed, it could be expanded. A second complaint wouldn't be met with the same shrug. It would be seen as a pattern. Benny could feel the edges tightening, the space around him shrinking with invisible walls. The car with the out-of-state plates returned again that night, only this time it stayed longer. Its engine idled quietly for over 90 minutes, lights off, driver unseen. Benny didn't confront it. He simply logged the time, the license plate, and the weather conditions in a notebook he now kept by the front door. He had 5 entries already, each marked with calm, detached language, no theories, no emotions, just the facts. He wasn't preparing for revenge. He was preparing for a record. It was around this time that something inside him shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a floorboard settling beneath old weight. He began waking up earlier than usual, sometimes before dawn, and instead of brewing coffee or checking his schedule, he would go outside, stand beside the truck, and just look at the street. Not to watch for anything in particular. Just to let whoever was watching know that he was awake too, that he wasn't hiding, that he wasn't going to move. This subtle shift in behavior had an effect. By the end of the week, the parked car stopped showing up. In its place came something else, silence. No complaints, no citations, no messages. For a brief, flickering moment, Benny wondered if it was over. It wasn't. Saturday morning, he received a letter. Not an official notice, not a threat, just a single folded sheet of paper without a return address, left in his mailbox without a stamp. The message was typed, the language was vague, but its intent was crystalline. It accused him of creating a hostile environment, weaponizing local authorities, and deliberately targeting community members with malicious intent. It ended with a line that read more like a verdict than a warning. We are aware of your activities and action will be taken. Benny read it once, then again. No signature. No name. Just that tone, confident, indirect, and designed to make him doubt himself. But he didn't. Not anymore. Because now the game had changed. It had gone from petty vandalism to coordinated messaging. Someone wasn't just harassing him, they were trying to establish a case, a narrative, and if he didn't shape one of his own, they would define him completely. So Benny made a decision, not a dramatic one, but a strategic one. He took his growing file, the sensor logs, the notebook, the photos of the container behind his house, and the typed letter, and he mailed them to Bart with a simple note that, if anything happens to me, this is the story you start with. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a precaution. Like laying down sandbags before a flood. He didn't expect Bart to fight his battles. He just needed someone outside the immediate blast radius to hold the thread of truth. And once that was done, he went out to the truck, opened the hood, and began quietly disabling the decoy tank system, not because it had failed, but because he no longer wanted to play defense. The time for traps was over. Now it was about endurance. That afternoon, Karen made her return, not with accusations or yelling, but with hospitality. She stood at the fence line holding a plate of homemade lemon bars and an expression so sweet it bordered on absurd. Benny didn't take them. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, long enough to make the smile falter. She said something about mending fences, about bad energy in the neighborhood, and then left the plate on the fence post before walking away. He let the rain take care of the rest. By nightfall, the lemon bars were a soggy mess on the concrete. He swept them into the trash without a second thought. But that moment marked something else, a shift in posture, a retreat disguised as outreach. Karen was testing the water again, probing for weakness. Benny had expected another escalation. Instead, she changed tactics. The next morning, one of the Websters pulled him aside and gently asked if he was okay. When he asked what prompted the question, she said Karen had mentioned he'd been acting erratic and that she was worried about him being alone so much. It wasn't an insult. It was concern. Manufactured, yes, but concern nonetheless. And concern turned into whispering. Whispering turned into doubt. It was a longer game now, and Karen was playing it with velvet gloves. Benny knew he couldn't fight that kind of campaign directly. He couldn't prove what someone didn't say. He couldn't record thoughts, couldn't file evidence of whispers. But he could endure. He could show up every day on time, in control, polite, and precise. He could outlast the tension. Because sometimes the strongest counterattack wasn't retaliation, it was presence. Calm, quiet presence. That night, he received a call from a former client, one who had gone quiet after the gossip began. They wanted a small job done. Benny said yes. Not because of the money, but because it was proof. Proof that he hadn't been erased. That his work still spoke for him, even if whispers tried to speak louder. And as he loaded the truck the next morning, rain gone, sun low on the horizon, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not hope, not relief, but momentum. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just surviving. He was moving forward. And while he didn't know what Karen or whoever stood behind her would do next, he knew one thing with complete certainty. He was still here, and he wasn't going anywhere. It started again on a Thursday. The timing, Benny would later realize, was important. Thursdays were his longest days, when he left at dawn and didn't return until after dark, hauling parts across 2 counties with barely enough time to eat between deliveries. The moment he stepped out of the truck that night, something in the air felt wrong, not loud or obvious, but thick, weighted, like static before a lightning strike. The porch light flickered when he clicked it on, though it had never done that before. And when he turned to look at the truck, his last steady thing, he saw the unmistakable shine of fresh moisture trailing from the rear tire to the edge of the curb. For a split second, his brain tried to tell him it was water from the wet road, a puddle kicked up from his last stop. But it wasn't raining. Hadn't rained all day. And as he stepped closer, the scent hit him, sharp, bitter, unmistakable. Gasoline. Not the clean kind from a nozzle, but tainted, open air, slowly evaporating. He knelt down, followed the trail with his fingers, and then stood up slowly, eyes scanning the dark street. There was no one out, no motion behind the windows, just that same empty silence. But he knew he wasn't alone. Not anymore. By morning, he found that someone had jammed a stick into the fill port and snapped it off inside. A deliberate act. One that made sure he couldn't refuel without a full replacement. It was an inconvenience more than anything, a delay, an added cost, but it wasn't about the damage. It was the message. They were saying, we can get closer now. We can do it when you're not looking. And as he stood in the gravel driveway staring at the busted fuel cap, Benny felt something shift again, not fear, not even anger, but a grim acceptance that this wasn't going to stop, not until something broke. And if it wasn't going to be him, then it was going to have to be their rhythm, their control, their belief that they could act with impunity. So he changed course, not outwardly, not publicly. He didn't march over to Karen's house, didn't file a report, but quietly, tactically. He replaced the fuel cap. Then he reinstalled the decoy tank, but this time without any liquid inside, only air. The real tank he kept locked and fitted with a steel cover, one that required a tool to open. He adjusted the truck's angle so that anyone trying to reach the rear would have to be fully exposed to the street. And most importantly, he made no announcement. He said nothing to anyone, because sometimes the best counter to an invisible threat is to simply refuse to play your part as the victim. But the escalation didn't slow, it transformed. Where before it had been subtle, quiet footprints, whispered gossip, polite sabotage, now it began to show its teeth. A letter arrived, this one official-looking, with a city seal and his name typed in bold across the top. It was a complaint, again filed anonymously, citing unlicensed chemical handling and vehicular storage of hazardous materials. It came with an inspection date and a line near the bottom in small font warning of potential penalties, including citation or suspension of vehicle operation. Benny stared at the paper, running his thumb over the seal, feeling the chill of its implications. They weren't just trying to scare him now. They were trying to disarm him. Take the truck, take the work, and he'd have nothing left. No way to pay rent. No reason to stay. He folded the letter, placed it in his folder of documents, and drove to the civic office the next morning, not to fight, not to yell, but to ask questions, calmly, like a man with nothing to hide. The clerk behind the counter recognized him immediately. "You again," she said, not with rudeness, but with a weary sort of sympathy. "Someone's got it in for you." She flipped through her system, frowned, then looked up and lowered her voice. The complaint came with attachments, photos, of containers mostly, some fuel stuff. "Doesn't match your file, though. You're flagged for multiple reports now, but nothing's stuck." "Not yet." "Can I see the photos?" he asked. "Not unless it becomes an active investigation," she replied, but her tone softened. "I'd get a lawyer, just in case." He didn't. He couldn't afford one. But he did reach out to Bart again, and this time the conversation was different. Bart came to Benny's place that evening with a worn canvas bag and a six-pack of root beer, the kind you drink slow when you don't want your hands to shake. He didn't lecture. He didn't speculate. He just sat on the porch beside Benny and asked, "You want me to escalate this?" Benny didn't answer right away. He looked out at the street, watching the way the shadows leaned, the way the windows across the road reflected nothing. Then he nodded once. Bart finished his drink, stood, and said, "I'll have someone look into her background." Quietly. That phrase stuck with Benny, quietly. Everything about this had been quiet. No yelling, no broken windows, no police knocking on doors. Just the slow erosion of normalcy, the kind that makes you question yourself before you question anyone else. That's what made it so dangerous. And that's what made him so determined to outlast it. But determination couldn't stop what came next. 3 nights later, someone entered his property. He didn't see it happen. He didn't hear it. He only noticed the footprints the next morning, deep ones, heavier than Karen's, angled from the alley toward the truck and back again. And beneath the truck, tucked between the axle and the undercarriage, was a small plastic bag with shredded cloth and powder residue inside. It wasn't hidden well. It was meant to be found, meant to raise alarms, meant to look like something it maybe wasn't. He didn't touch it, didn't move it. He called Bart. Bart arrived within the hour, looked at the bag, then at Benny. "They're setting you up," he said, "and now they want the fire department involved. Hazmat, maybe. Get you flagged. Get the neighbors scared." He didn't say Karen's name, but they both knew. Bart called in a favor, had the bag removed by a friend on the force under the pretense of community safety. No official report. "You've got 2 options," he said afterward. "We go public, file charges, make it loud. or we keep building quietly. But we're running out of time. Benny thought about it for a long time, and then he chose neither. Instead, he went door to door, not with complaints, not with accusations, but with work. He offered free delivery for 1 week to 5 neighbors he hadn't spoken to in months. He fixed a leaky faucet for the Websters, helped rehang a fallen shutter for the Morales family. He made himself visible again, not as the man being targeted, but as the man who never stopped being part of the neighborhood, no matter who whispered otherwise. It worked. Slowly, eyes began to meet his again. Nods returned. One neighbor even mentioned, "Karen's been acting strange lately. A lot of packages. A lot of visitors." Benny said nothing. He didn't need to. The tide was turning. And when, 2 weeks later, a city official arrived for a surprise inspection, Benny was ready. Paperwork in order. Truck clean. No containers. No residue. No violations. The man left confused, almost apologetic. "We keep getting these reports," he said, "but nothing ever checks out." Benny smiled. For the first time in weeks, a real smile. Because now they weren't just trying to prove he was a problem. They were proving they couldn't break him. The first real break came not from a confrontation or a camera, but from an accident of timing, one of those rare moments when the right person sees the wrong thing at exactly the right time. Benny had been helping the Websters move an old refrigerator out of their garage, a clunky, rust-flecked relic that hadn't worked in years but somehow still weighed as much as a safe. It was late afternoon, and they were maneuvering it toward the end of the driveway when a sharp clatter drew all their attention toward the far end of the block. There, across the street, a delivery van had knocked over a recycling bin, and the driver clearly jumped out to reset it. Nothing remarkable. Except in doing so, the van briefly blocked the view of Karen's driveway. When it pulled away, Mr. Webster squinted toward her house, his expression darkening as he mumbled, "Now what the hell is she doing?" Benny followed his gaze and froze. A man in plain dark clothes was crouched behind Karen's gate, tools in hand, fumbling with what looked like a battery pack. A black case sat next to him, open and gleaming with cables and clamps. He didn't wear a uniform. He wasn't a city worker. And when he looked up and saw the 3 of them standing together, he flinched. Not startled like someone caught in an innocent act, but like someone seen who wasn't meant to be. He stood up slowly, closed the case without a word, and walked around the back of the house without acknowledging them. A few moments later, a side door opened, and Karen herself stepped out, exchanged a few words with the man, then looked straight at Benny. No wave, no smile, just a look hard, flat, unapologetic. Then she turned and disappeared back inside, the man following behind her like a shadow that didn't belong in daylight. Mr. Webster, usually mild and reluctant to speak ill of anyone, muttered under his breath, "That's not normal." Benny didn't reply, but something inside him settled with finality. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. Now it was witnessed. Confirmed. And more than that, other people were finally seeing it too. That night, Benny didn't sleep. He didn't pace or fret or run through plans. He just sat in his kitchen, a folder of documents spread across the table, his phone beside him, and waited for the idea to come into focus. There had been enough games. Enough small moves. Karen wasn't going to stop because small losses didn't affect her. She'd misread him, assumed he'd fold, assumed he was alone. And for a while he had been. But now? The balance was shifting. People were watching her now too. Is that changed everything. So he made a decision, sharp and clean. The following morning, he went to the city inspector's office not to file a complaint, but to request access to public record filings made against him in the past 90 days. As a resident, he had the right to view them. It took a little back and forth, a few forms, and a short conversation with the senior clerk, but by lunchtime he had the files in his hand. 13 complaints, all anonymous, all centered around property code violations, environmental safety, and alleged suspicious activity. Each attached to photos poorly framed, often blurry, but unmistakably taken from Karen's vantage point. He brought the file to Bart. The old cop took one look, flipped through the pages, and let out a long, low whistle. "This is what I needed," he said. "Now it's not just harassment, it's targeted, documented, and sustained. With these, I can go to my contact in the city attorney's office. Might not bring charges yet, but it'll make noise." Benny nodded. That's all he wanted now. Noise in the right direction. Noise that would slow her down, box her in. Because if there was one thing Karen feared more than losing control, it was being seen for what she really was: calculated, manipulative, relentless. She could handle suspicion. But exposure? That was different. The next 48 hours passed like a wire pulled taut, nothing happening on the surface, but beneath it, tension humming so loud it felt like pressure in the ears. Benny kept to his routine. He worked. He cleaned. He stayed visible. He answered when spoken to. And he waited. And then, on Saturday afternoon, it broke. A city official, accompanied by a police officer, arrived at Karen's door. No sirens. No shouting. Just presence. They spoke with her for nearly 20 minutes. She gestured wildly at one point, then calmed, then vanished inside for several minutes before returning with a folder of her own. The officer took it without expression. The city official scribbled something in a notepad. Benny didn't watch from the window. He didn't gloat. He simply stood in his yard, trimming hedges that didn't need trimming, letting the moment unfold without interfering. Because now the narrative was out of her hands. That evening, just after dark, someone knocked on his door. He opened it to find Karen standing there, hair pulled back, lips tight, hands empty. "We need to talk," she said flatly. Benny didn't move. "I think you've misunderstood a lot of things," she continued, eyes darting behind him into the house like she expected to see an audience. "There's been pressure on me too, you know. Things you wouldn't understand. I was trying to protect the neighborhood." Benny didn't interrupt. He let her speak, let the guiltless justification tumble out. There was no apology, of course. Karen didn't apologize. But there was tension in her voice, a forced calm that couldn't hide the panic just underneath. She was unraveling, not publicly, not yet, but at the seams, quietly, the same way she had tried to unravel him. He waited until she finished, then said only one thing: "It ends now." She stared at him for a long time, then turned and walked away. That night the truck was left untouched. The following day, a neighborhood notice appeared in mailboxes announcing an upcoming meeting to discuss a pattern of false complaints submitted by a resident. It didn't name her. It didn't have to. People knew. Enough had seen. Enough had heard. The performance was over. Benny slept deeply for the first time in weeks. No alarms. No footsteps. Just quiet. Not the kind of silence that meant isolation, but the kind that meant peace, however temporary. Because he understood something others didn't. People like Karen didn't truly stop. They receded. They regrouped. But the difference now was that he had shifted the weight. He wasn't the one being chased anymore. He had taken back his ground, inch by inch, not through violence or spectacle, but through patience, structure, and presence. And in the end, that's what beat her: not a trap, not revenge, but the simple refusal to break. She had come for his gas, but what she really wanted was his retreat, and he never gave it. The lab report arrived 5 days later in a white envelope marked confidential client copy only. It didn't need to scream to carry weight. Michelle opened it at the desk in her motel room, flipping past the cover page and straight into the results section. The conclusions were written in neutral, technical language, but even she could read through the tone. Soil samples near the creek bed showed elevated levels of aldrin and dieldrin-banned pesticides with a known history of groundwater contamination. One of the water samples tested positive for residue consistent with industrial degreasers solvents that had no business being anywhere near agricultural property. And though the levels weren't catastrophic, they were above recommended exposure thresholds. The report made no conclusions about who had placed the chemicals there or when. That wasn't its purpose. But it did verify the most important thing: there was contamination, and it was real. Angela reviewed the findings and wasted no time. She submitted the report directly to the County Environmental Division with a formal complaint, flagged the location coordinates, and attached the testing firm's credentials to preempt any challenge about validity. But that wasn't the move that shifted the balance. The real blow came when Angela sent a courtesy copy of the report to the Land Use Committee, specifically to the same department that had issued Michelle the compliance notice just weeks before. The message was subtle but sharp. If they were going to accuse her of improper land use, then they needed to answer for why they had allowed contaminated runoff to go uninspected for years under their watch. That same afternoon, Michelle received a terse phone call from a man who introduced himself only as Deputy Director Green. His tone was defensive, measured, and quick to clarify that his office had no prior knowledge of chemical violations on the property in question, and that a site inspection would be scheduled within the month. Michelle said nothing. She didn't need to. The moment had arrived, the point where silence started costing the people who had once benefited from it. She didn't hear anything from Willard Rex for 3 days. Not a phone call, not a letter, not an appearance. Then, early Thursday morning, she arrived at the property to find a vehicle already parked near the southern boundary. A black SUV with tinted windows and out-of-county plates. Angela had warned her that once the report was submitted, people might start surfacing quietly, unofficially, and with a vested interest in controlling the narrative before it spilled into public view. She pulled in slowly, parked on the opposite side of the entrance, and stepped out without haste. The driver's side door of the SUV opened, and out stepped a man in a navy windbreaker, late 50s, with a face that looked accustomed to saying little and listening too well. "Miss Harrison," he said, not smiling. "I understand you've had a busy month." Michelle folded her arms. "I don't know who you are." "I'm not here to challenge your claim," he replied quickly, raising both hands as if to prove it. "In fact, I'm not officially here at all. I'm just someone who's been asked to understand what might be escalating." Michelle didn't move. She wasn't intimidated, but she also wasn't naive. This wasn't a casual drop-in. The man continued. "There are people who prefer problems like this get resolved without turning into case files or headlines. No one benefits when old dirt becomes public record, especially not when it predates the current owners." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then they shouldn't have buried anything." He gave a small nod, almost acknowledging her point, then said, "You've made your position clear. That matters. You have every legal right to press forward. But just understand, some people may not give up their history so easily, even if it was borrowed land." Michelle didn't answer. He turned, opened his door, and got back inside. The SUV reversed in silence and drove off without another word. That afternoon, Angela filed a motion to compel testimony from Willard Rex regarding historical land use practices on adjoining properties. It was a tactical play not meant to produce immediate answers, but to lock him into a legal posture. Once compelled, any statements he made could be used in civil or criminal proceedings. Angela expected resistance. What she didn't expect was what happened next. 2 days later, just before the scheduled review hearing on the boundary dispute, Angela received a call from a county representative advising that Willard Rex had officially withdrawn his claim of adverse possession. No explanation, no substitution of parties, just a quiet, unceremonious withdrawal. The hearing was canceled. The review process closed. Michelle's title was now uncontested and fully recognized by the county. But the story didn't end with a clean declaration of victory. Hours after the claim was withdrawn, Michelle received a package at the motel. No name, no return address. Inside was a faded map, hand-drawn, annotated, old enough to show creases worn nearly to tearing. It detailed the entire parcel and surrounding properties with remarkable precision. A red X was marked near the creek bed, with 3 dates listed in small handwriting: -2001, 2004, 2009. On the back was a single sentence, "If this goes down, I'm not going with it alone." She brought the map to Angela the next morning. Neither of them recognized the handwriting, but the meaning was unmistakable. Someone else knew what had been done to that land. Someone with their own buried skeletons, and a fear of becoming the scapegoat if the story ever reached a courtroom. Angela wasn't shaken. She was calculating. "This is a pressure valve," she said. "It means they're fractured. Someone inside wants an exit plan. That's leverage, and it's valuable." Michelle didn't say what she was thinking, that she hadn't come here looking for leverage, that she had simply wanted to protect what was hers. But the reality was no longer that simple. She wasn't just defending property, now she was a live wire in a closed circuit that had run without interruption for years. And someone had just signaled they were ready to break that circuit before it broke them. Over the following week, the work resumed. The southern boundary was reset with permanent fencing. The environmental review began in full, slow, and methodical. Angela worked behind the scenes to ensure Michelle's full legal insulation, drafting immunity provisions and third-party disclosures to cover any findings unrelated to her ownership period. Michelle kept to the work. She didn't celebrate. She didn't grandstand. She focused on the land, on grounding herself in its shape, its texture, its rhythm. Because while the legal battle had ended, something deeper had shifted. And the land was no longer just a place she had inherited. It had become the line she refused to surrender.